The drive up to the cabin took longer than expected. The old gravel road twisted and turned through miles of dense forest, trees so thick they swallowed most of the late afternoon light. My truck bounced over deep ruts, tires spitting up dust and loose rocks. The GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and I was relying on an old, faded map my uncle had given me. He used to own the cabin, said it was the perfect place to get away from everything. No neighbors, no noise, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of branches under a passing deer's hooves. By the time I pulled up to the clearing, the sun was dipping below the horizon, staining the sky in streaks of red and orange. The cabin stood in the middle of a small, overgrown patch of land, its wooden walls weathered from years of harsh winters and scorching summers. It had a slanted tin roof, a front porch with a couple of chairs, and a single window that reflected the last light of the day. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I grabbed my bags from the back of the truck, slung them over my shoulder, and walked up the creaky wooden steps. The key was exactly where my uncle said it would be, tucked inside a rusted tin can beneath the porch. The inside of the cabin was simple. A small living area with a sagging couch, a wooden table, a wood-burning stove in the corner. A single hallway led to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. Dust hung in the air, stirred up by my arrival. I dropped my bags by the door and went to open the windows. The cool evening air slipped inside, carrying with it the distant sound of chirping insects and rustling leaves. I flicked on the light switch, half expecting nothing to happen, but the single bulb in the ceiling hummed to life, casting a dull yellow glow. It was quiet, too quiet. I shook off the unease, chalking it up to my nerves. City living had spoiled me. I was used to the distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout of a neighbor, the flicker of streetlights outside my window. Here, the silence felt too thick, too heavy. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacked my bag, checked the pantry, made sure the water was still running. My uncle had left behind a few supplies, cans of beans, a bag of rice, some bottled water. There was even an old rifle leaning against the wall, a box of ammo sitting next to it. I stepped outside as the last of the light faded, taking a moment to soak in the stillness. The sky was black now, stars scattered across it like shattered glass. The forest loomed around me, an endless wall of darkness. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, but nothing else. No animals, no distant calls of birds, just the wind. I turned back inside and locked the door. That first night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every shift in the wood, had me wide awake, staring at the ceiling. It was colder than I expected. The blankets weren't enough, and I found myself shivering beneath them. I could hear the wind outside, pushing against the walls, whistling through the cracks. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I thought I heard something else. A sound just outside the cabin. A slow, deliberate crunch, like a footstep on dried leaves. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Another crunch, closer this time. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer wandering too close. But deep down, something felt off. I reached for the rifle, fingers closing around the cold metal. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. The sound didn't come again. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The ground was damp from the night's dew, the air crisp. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the ground. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not from an animal. Too large, too deep. They circled the cabin, stopping just beneath my bedroom window. My stomach twisted. I was alone, miles away from the nearest town. No cell service. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the feeling. Chopping wood, checking the cabin for anything out of place. The door had been locked, the windows too, but the footprints, someone had been outside, watching. That night, I kept the rifle close. I forced myself to sleep, but every sound made me jolt awake. And then, around midnight, the knocking started. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, gripping the rifle, breath caught in my throat. Came from the front door. Not frantic, Not urgent, just patient. I stayed frozen, listening. Then, after a long pause, the doorknob rattled. I raised the rifle, aimed it at the door, my hands slick with sweat. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. The knob stopped moving. The knocking didn't come again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I packed my bags, threw them in the truck, and sped down that gravel road, leaving a trail of dust behind me. I didn't stop until I was back in town, back in civilization, where the noise and the people felt like a shield against whatever had been out there in the woods. I told my uncle what had happened. He just stared at me for a long time before finally saying, "You did the right thing leaving. That was the last time I ever set foot near that cabin, and I never will again." The drive up to the cabin took longer than I thought it would. The roads wound through dense forest, trees pressing in from both sides. Felt like I was driving into nowhere. No streetlights, no houses, just miles of dirt and gravel under my tires. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. My phone had lost service an hour ago, and I hadn't seen another car since I turned off the main road. Just me, the road, and the trees. I had rented the cabin for a week. I needed a break. Work had been relentless. My apartment felt like a prison, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a full night's sleep. The idea of solitude, of absolute quiet, had sounded perfect. A week away from people, from responsibilities. Just me and the woods. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the treetops. The cabin was small but sturdy, built of thick logs with a heavy wooden door and a single window on the front. The forest surrounded it on all sides. No neighboring cabins, no roads beyond the one I came in on. I grabbed my bags, locked the car, and went inside. The interior was simple, just a living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a bedroom with a stiff-looking bed, and a bathroom with an old iron tub. Everything smelled like wood and dust. I unpacked quickly, made a weak attempt at dinner, then sat in the dim light of the fireplace, listening to the wind press against the cabin. It was peaceful. For the first time in months, I felt something close to calm. That feeling didn't last. The first night, I woke up to a sound, a dull thud, like something heavy hitting the ground outside. My heart pounded as I lay there, staring at the ceiling. I told myself it was a branch. The wind had been strong. I almost believed it. Then I heard another sound, closer this time. A slow, dragging noise, like something being pulled through the dirt. I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the pounding of my own pulse. The noise stopped. The cabin was silent. I waited, barely breathing, but nothing else came. Eventually, exhaustion won. I fell asleep again, telling myself it had been my imagination. In the morning, I went outside. The ground was undisturbed. No fallen branches. No signs of anything moving through the dirt. Just my own footprints from the night before. I laughed at myself, shook off the nerves, and went about my day. I hiked a little, took photos, tried to enjoy the solitude. By the time the sun started setting, I felt normal again. Then the second night came. It was worse. I woke up to a sharp, rhythmic tapping. It sounded deliberate, like someone knocking. It wasn't on the door. It was on the window. The only window in the cabin. The one facing the woods. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. My skin crawled. I wanted to check. I wanted to look, but I couldn't make myself do it. Morning took forever to come. When it did, I went outside again. Nothing. No footprints, no marks on the window, nothing out of place. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew what I had heard. By the third night, I wasn't sleeping at all. I sat up in bed, blanket pulled to my chin, waiting. The night stretched on, and then, just before dawn, the noise came back. Not knocking this time. Footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps circling the cabin. My chest felt tight. My hands shook. I thought about running to my car, but that meant going outside. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I stayed still, listening, waiting for it to stop. The footsteps circled twice, then faded into the woods. I lasted one more night. On the fourth night, something changed. The noises weren't outside anymore. I was in bed, eyes locked on the ceiling, when I heard it. The sound of wood creaking inside the cabin. I sat up, heart hammering. The air felt thick, heavy. I strained to listen, barely daring to breathe. Then I heard it again. The sound of weight shifting on the wooden floor. I wasn't alone. I moved slowly, carefully reaching under the bed where I had kept my only real weapon, a hunting knife I had brought just in case. My fingers closed around the handle, my pulse roaring in my ears. The floor creaked again, closer this time. I gripped the knife so hard my hand ached. I couldn't see anything in the darkness. I didn't know if I wanted to. My mind raced through options. The front door was too far. My car keys were on the kitchen counter. I had no idea what I was dealing with. I made my decision in a split second. I bolted. I crashed through the bedroom door, barely registering movement in the dark. Something shifted behind me. I didn't stop. I lunged for the kitchen, snatching my keys with shaking hands. Behind me, I heard it move. It was fast, too fast. I threw myself at the front door, fumbled with the lock, yanked it open. Cold air hit my face. I ran. The night swallowed me whole, but I didn't care. I sprinted for my car, lungs burning, my ears straining for the sound of pursuit. I reached the car, yanked the door open, slammed it shut behind me. My fingers fumbled with the keys. The engine turned over, slow, too slow. My breath came in panicked gasps. Then finally it roared to life. I hit the gas so hard the tires skidded. The headlights cut through the darkness, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see. I just drove, fast, reckless, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest town, hours later. I parked in a gas station lot, hands still trembling on the wheel. My mind was a mess of fear and exhaustion. I didn't know what I had seen, or if I had seen anything at all, but I knew without a doubt that I had not been alone in that cabin. I never went back. I left everything behind. My clothes, my bags, even my phone charger. None of it mattered. I didn't care about the money I'd wasted or the things I'd lost. I only cared about one thing, getting away. I don't know who or what was in that cabin with me. I don't want to know. I only know that I was lucky. I got out, and I won't make the mistake of going back. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. I had rented it for a week, wanting solitude, a break from the noise of the city. The idea of waking up to the sounds of nature instead of honking cars and sirens felt like a dream. I had packed enough food, water, and firewood to last the trip. My phone had no signal, but that was expected. I told myself it would be refreshing to disconnect for a while. The first night was peaceful. The cabin was old but sturdy, with thick wooden walls and a heavy front door. The fireplace crackled as I read a book under the dim glow of a lantern. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and I let the sound lull me to sleep. By the second night, I started noticing small things that felt off. The front door, which I knew I had locked, was slightly ajar when I woke up. I convinced myself I had been careless. Maybe I had been too tired and hadn't shut it properly. I made sure to lock it again that night, double-checking before heading to bed. At around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. The cabin was silent, but something felt wrong. I listened for a few minutes, straining my ears. Then, I heard it. Faint rustling just outside. Could have been an animal, but something about the sound didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the random scurrying of a squirrel or the crunching of leaves under a deer's hooves. It was slow, deliberate. I lay still in bed, waiting. Eventually, the noise stopped, and I told myself it was nothing. The woods were full of creatures. It was bound to happen. Still, I had a hard time falling back asleep. The third night, things escalated. I made sure to lock the door and even placed a chair under the handle. I didn't want to take any chances. As I settled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The quietness of the woods now felt unnatural, as if something were suppressing all other sounds. At around midnight, the rustling started again. This time, it was closer. I held my breath, listening. Then, I heard its soft footsteps, right outside the cabin. Not the light patter of an animal, but the unmistakable weight of a human step. My blood ran cold. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, circling it. My heart pounded in my chest. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted me to hear them. I stayed awake all night, gripping a knife from the kitchen, waiting. When the first light of dawn seeped through the trees, the footsteps were gone. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. There were footprints in the dirt, clear and human. I followed them a few feet before they disappeared into the dense woods. I wanted to leave right then, but my car was parked a mile away where the road ended. I had hiked in to reach the cabin, enjoying the isolation at the time. Now, that distance felt like a trap. If someone was watching me, they would see me coming from a mile away. That day, I kept my knife close and my ears open. I checked every window and door repeatedly, but nothing else happened. I debated whether to wait until morning to leave or make a run for my car before the sun went down. In the end, I decided to go at first light when I had the best visibility. That night was the longest of my life. The footsteps returned, heavier this time, more confident. Whoever it was, they knew I was inside and they didn't care. At one point, I heard the door handle jiggle. The chair held firm, but I was sure if they wanted to, they could have forced their way in. I sat in the dark, gripping my knife, barely breathing. I didn't sleep. I barely blinked. I just waited. As soon as the sun started rising, I grabbed my backpack and bolted. I didn't bother cleaning up or locking the cabin behind me. I ran through the trees, heart pounding, every shadow making me feel like someone was right behind me. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. I started the engine, floored the gas, and didn't look back until I was miles away. A few days later, I checked the local news, half expecting to see something about a break-in or an escaped convict. There was nothing. No reports of anyone in the area. No missing persons. Nothing at all. To this day, I don't know who was outside that cabin. I don't know what they wanted. And I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I never planned to stay at the cabin alone. It was supposed to be a weekend away with my friend Chris, a chance to unwind, fish, and escape the noise of the city. But at the last minute, Chris bailed, something about work deadlines. I should have just canceled, but I had already taken the time off, and the idea of some solitude seemed nice. It was only 2 nights. I figured I could handle it. The drive up was uneventful, just miles of empty road cutting through thick trees. The cabin sat near a lake, isolated but not completely off the grid. There was a small town about 20 minutes away, a gas station, a diner, a few other cabins scattered along the water. Enough civilization to feel safe, but far enough to get the quiet I wanted. The cabin itself was small, 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with an old wood-burning stove. It smelled like pine and dust. The owner, an older man named Frank, had left the key under a rock near the porch like he said he would. I checked my phone, 1 bar, maybe enough for a call if I stood in the right spot. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unpacked my cooler, set up my fishing gear, and walked down to the lake. The water was calm, almost unnaturally still. No birds, no wind, just silence. I tried not to let it get to me, but something about that quiet made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. By the time the sun started dipping behind the trees, I was back inside, heating up a can of soup on the old gas stove. The cabin creaked occasionally, old wood settling. I wasn't scared, but I was aware of how alone I was, how far away help would be if I needed it. I went to bed early, the exhaustion from the drive hitting me hard. The bed was stiff, the sheets smelled a little musty, but I drifted off quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not to a noise exactly, more like the absence of one. The creaks of the cabin had stopped. No wind outside, no rustling trees. Just complete, suffocating silence. I listened, heart pounding, but heard nothing. It was irrational, but I felt like something was out there. I stayed in bed, forcing my breathing to stay even. Minutes passed. Then, just as I was starting to drift off again, I heard it, a soft crunch outside. Footsteps, not an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I waited, frozen, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. I sat up slowly, not wanting to make a sound. The window beside the bed was cracked open, just enough to let in the night air. I slid out of bed and pressed myself against the wall. My brain scrambled for logical explanations. A bear? Maybe, but bears didn't move like that. I reached for my phone, but I already knew it was useless. One bar, maybe none now. Even if I called 911, help wouldn't get here in time. My mind raced. The cabin door was locked, but the windows? I hadn't checked them all. Then another sound, this time from the front porch. A slow, deliberate step on the wooden boards. My stomach knotted. I thought about calling out, but something stopped me. If it was another person, why wouldn't they announce themselves? A lost hiker would have knocked, called out for help. This wasn't that. Whoever was out there didn't want me to know they were there. I needed to act. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, gripping it tight. The next sound sent ice down my spine. The unmistakable scrape of metal against wood. The doorknob. Someone was testing it. I moved fast, staying low, creeping toward the kitchen where I had left the knife from earlier. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out. But where? The car was parked a few feet from the porch, but the keys were in my bag, too close to the door. Then silence again. I held my breath. Maybe they had given up. Maybe it was my imagination. I stayed still for what felt like forever. Then bang. The door rattled hard, like someone had slammed a shoulder into it. I jumped, my pulse hammering. I gripped the knife, stepping backward. The cabin had no back door, no escape except the windows. If they got in, I'd be trapped. Bang. Another hit, harder this time. The wood groaned. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my keys, yanked the bedroom window open as quietly as I could, and slipped out into the night. The air was freezing, my breath loud in my ears. I crouched low, listening. The pounding on the door stopped. Whoever it was, they had heard me. I ran. Not to the car, I wasn't stupid. If they saw me go for it, they could get there first. Instead, I bolted for the trees, the knife still clutched in my hand. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I just ran, ducking behind a thick tree trunk, forcing myself to stay quiet. Minutes passed. My chest ached from holding my breath. Then movement near the cabin. A shadow shifted. Someone stepped off the porch, slowly, looking around. They were searching for me. I couldn't make out details. Just a dark figure, tall, moving with unsettling patience. They walked toward my car, then stopped. They knew I wasn't inside. I prayed they would just take the car and leave, but they didn't. Instead, they turned back toward the cabin and stepped inside. My stomach twisted. I needed to get out of there. As quietly as I could, I moved deeper into the woods, careful not to snap any branches. My only thought was reaching the main road, finding help. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs shaking, every noise making my heart jump. Finally, I saw headlights in the distance, a car coming down the road. I ran, stumbling out of the trees, waving my arms. The car skidded to a stop. An older man, probably in his 60s, rolled down the window, eyes wide. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked. I barely got the words out. "Someone's in my cabin." He didn't ask questions. He just unlocked the door and motioned for me to get in. As we drove toward town, I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching. The police checked the cabin. The door had been forced open, my stuff rummaged through, but nothing was stolen. No prints, no sign of who it had been. Just an empty cabin, a busted door, and a question I never got an answer to. Whoever it was, they weren't there to rob me. They had been looking for something else, or someone. I had no reason to be out there alone. Maybe it was the stress from work, or maybe I just needed to get away from everything for a while. I found the listing online, an old hunting cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me and the quiet. It seemed perfect. A week of isolation sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive was long, and the roads got worse the farther I went. Paved streets turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to something that barely passed as a road at all. The trees grew thicker, pressing in on either side like walls. The GPS lost signal miles before I reached the cabin, but I had a printed map. I followed it carefully, counting turns and landmarks like the rental guy told me to. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Small, weathered, but sturdy. A single story with a steeply pitched roof and a porch that sagged a little in the middle. The woods surrounded it completely. No other houses, no other people. Just me. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked my supplies, made a small fire outside, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. It felt good to be away from everything. At night, the quiet was so deep it almost had weight. No cars, no hum of electricity, not even the distant sound of a plane overhead. Just the wind and the occasional rustle in the undergrowth. I went to bed early, listening to the sound of the fire dying out. It was the best sleep I'd had in months. The second day I hiked. There was a trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. It wasn't marked, but it was clear enough that I could follow it without getting lost. I walked for hours, breathing in the fresh air, feeling my body loosen up. The stress of the city started to fade. But when I turned back, something felt off. The trail looked different. I knew I hadn't taken any turns, but the trees seemed closer together than before. The path felt narrower, like the forest was slowly closing in around me. I shook it off, chalked it up to my imagination. I kept walking. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresher, the edges sharp, the dirt still unsettled. And they weren't alone. There were several sets, overlapping each other. I stopped, listening hard, but there was nothing. Just the wind, just the trees. I walked faster, trying to ignore the creeping feeling in my gut. The cabin wasn't far now. I kept my head down, moving quickly, following my own tracks back. I reached the clearing just as the sun started to dip behind the trees. The door was open. I knew I'd locked it. I was sure of it. My hands were sweating as I stepped onto the porch, heart pounding. I pushed the door open wider, peering inside. Nothing looked disturbed. My bags were still where I left them. The kitchen was the same. The living area, the small bedroom, all untouched. I checked every corner, every shadow. Nothing. Still, I locked the door behind me and checked the windows. Every latch was in place. I told myself the wind had done it, or maybe I hadn't closed it all the way. But I knew that wasn't true. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every groan of the old would send my heart racing. The darkness outside felt thicker, heavier. Something was out there, watching, waiting. On the third day, I found the first sign of real trouble. A deer torn open just beyond the clearing. Its ribs jutted out, the flesh stripped away in long, careful slices. Not the messy work of a predator. This was something else, something deliberate. I backed away, stomach turning. The air smelled wrong, coppery and thick. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I needed to leave. Now, I packed quickly, throwing everything into my bag. My hands were shaking as I zipped it closed. I grabbed my keys, my flashlight, and stepped outside. The woods had gone silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. I forced myself forward, locking the cabin behind me. I moved fast, heading straight for my truck. The dirt road stretched ahead, empty and quiet. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and turned the key. Nothing. The engine didn't even click. Just silence. My stomach dropped. I tried again. Still nothing. I popped the hood, got out, and checked the battery. The cables were gone. Cut cleanly, precisely. Panic surged up my throat. Someone had done this. Someone had been out here, watching me. I turned, scanning the trees, searching for movement. There was nothing, just the heavy, pressing silence. I had two choices: stay in the cabin and wait for help that might never come, or start walking. I chose to walk. The nearest town was miles away, but I had no other option. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, and started down the road. The light faded fast, the trees swallowing the last of the sun. I kept moving, my steps quick and steady. Then I saw them, figures standing between the trees, still, silent, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't run. I just kept walking, forcing my breath to stay steady. My hands clenched around the straps of my bag, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark. I walked for hours, never looking back. The figures never moved, never made a sound. They were just there, waiting. Then, in the distance, I saw headlights. A truck, moving slow, coming toward me. I ran, waving my arms, shouting. The truck slowed, then stopped. The driver was an old man, his face lined and weathered. He looked at me, then past me into the trees. "Come on," he said, his voice low. "Urgent." I didn't hesitate. I climbed in, slammed the door, and locked it. He turned the truck around, not saying a word. As we drove, I glanced back once. The figures were gone. The man never asked what happened, and I never told him. He dropped me at a gas station on the edge of town. I called a tow, got my truck fixed, and left. I never went back for my things. I never spoke about it. I don't know who or what was out there in those woods, and I never want to find out. The first time I saw the cabin, it didn't look like anything special. It was just an old wooden structure, tucked deep in the woods, a few miles off a narrow dirt road. It belonged to my uncle, or at least it used to. He had passed away a few months ago, and since no one else in the family wanted it, I took it. I didn't even hesitate. It wasn't like I had anywhere better to be. I had lost my job, my apartment, and my girlfriend all within the span of 6 months. Life in the city had worn me down, and I figured some time alone in the woods might be good for me. Maybe I could fix the place up, sell it, and use the money to start over somewhere else. The drive up was rough. My uncle had never bothered to maintain the road leading to the cabin, and my truck's tires struggled against the loose dirt and scattered rocks. The trees grew thick around me, blocking out the sun, making the air feel heavy and still. When I finally arrived, I killed the engine and just sat there for a moment, staring at the cabin. It looked smaller than I remembered. The paint had long since peeled away, the windows were covered in grime, and the front porch sagged under its own weight. I climbed out of the truck, stretched my legs, and made my way up the creaking steps. The front door was stiff, but after a few hard shoves, it gave way with a groan. The inside smelled like dust and old wood. My uncle hadn't lived here full-time, only visiting for hunting trips and the occasional weekend getaway. The furniture was basic: an old couch, a wooden table, a few mismatched chairs. The kitchen had an old propane stove and a fridge that I doubted still worked. There was a small bedroom in the back, and a single bathroom with rusty pipes and a toilet that took far too long to flush. I spent the first few days cleaning. The air inside was stale, so I opened all the windows. Dust clung to everything. I swept the floors, wiped down the counters, and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that settled deep in my gut. Maybe it was just being out there alone. The silence was different from the city. Too thick, too complete. The only sounds were the wind through the trees, the creak of old wood, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush outside. The first night was the worst. I lay on the old mattress in the back room, staring at the ceiling, listening. I kept thinking I heard something. Small sounds, like footsteps on dry leaves, or the soft scrape of something against the walls. Every time I sat up, the noise stopped. I told myself it was just animals. Probably raccoons, maybe a deer passing through. The woods were full of life, and I wasn't used to it. A few days in, I started noticing things. Small things at first. The front door was unlocked one morning when I was sure I had locked it the night before. A chair was slightly out of place. A window I knew I had shut was open again. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. Maybe I hadn't locked the door. Maybe the wind had pushed the window open. Then one afternoon, I found something that made my stomach drop. I had gone outside to chop some wood when I noticed the footprints. They were faint but fresh, too big to be an animal. I followed them around the cabin, my heart pounding. They circled the structure, stopping at the windows, lingering by the door. Someone had been watching me. That night, I locked every door and window. I kept the hatchet by my bed. I barely slept, jerking awake at every sound. At some point in the early hours of the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside the walls. I held my breath, gripping the handle of the hatchet so hard my fingers ached. The footsteps stopped near the front door. I waited. Minutes passed, then an hour, then nothing. By morning, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe isolation was getting to me. But when I stepped outside, the footprints were there again, clearer this time. Someone had been standing just outside my door. I should have left then. I should have packed my bags and driven away without looking back. But I didn't. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself it was just some drifter passing through. I told myself a lot of things to keep from admitting the truth. I was scared. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. The woods felt different. The birds weren't singing as much. The usual rustling in the underbrush had stopped. I felt watched, constantly on edge. I barely ate. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just outside, breathing, waiting. Then one night it all came to a head. I was lying in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep, when I heard it. The soft creak of the porch. Slow, steady. Someone was out there. I sat up, gripping the hatchet, heart hammering. The sound moved to the door. A pause. Then the doorknob rattled. I held my breath. Another pause. Then a single, slow knock. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The knock came again, louder this time, then again, and again. Each knock more forceful than the last. The walls felt too thin. The locks felt useless. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence pressed in from all sides. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself outside. The footprints were there, deep, aggressive. Whoever had been there had stood outside for a long time, watching, waiting. I didn't pack. I didn't hesitate. I got into my truck and drove, pushing the engine harder than I should have. The trees blurred past me, and I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, 20 miles away. I found a cheap motel and locked myself inside, shaking, exhausted, but unable to sleep. The next morning, I called a realtor. I put the cabin up for sale. I didn't go back. I didn't even collect my things. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to wait around to find out. A few months later, the realtor called to tell me they had a buyer. I didn't ask who. I didn't care. I signed the papers, took the money, and never looked back. I still think about the cabin sometimes. I wonder who or what was out there. I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door that night. But mostly, I'm just grateful I never had to find out.